welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor, Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Dr. George Elliott Clarke is a native of Windsor, Nova Scotia. He is a seventh-generation Canadian of African American and Mi'kmaq Indigenous descent. He earned his BA from the University of Waterloo, MA from Dalhousie University, and PhD from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, which is where I first met him. Clarke has served as both Poet Laureate of Toronto, Ontario, and Parliamentary Poet Laureate of Canada, and he teaches Canadian literature at the University of Toronto. He is a member of the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada. He has written too many books to mention, but some particular favorites of mine are Saltwater Spirituals and Deeper Blues, Whylah Falls, which he later adapted for the radio and stage, Lush Dreams, Blue Exile, Fugitive Poems, Execution Poems, the Black Acadian Tragedy of George and Rue, which won the Governor General's Literary Award, Red, Black, Blue, Gold, White. Those are all separate book titles, everyone. Canticles, War Canticles, Canticles III, and Where Beauty Survived, an Africadian Memoir. He's also the author of many critical and scholarly works, including Odysseys Home, Mapping African Canadian Literature. George Elliott Clarke is no stranger to these Detroit River borderlands and to Bookfest Festival du Livre Windsor in particular. And this October, he'll be appearing at Bookfest Windsor again. On October 14th, he'll be appearing at the Windsor launch of his latest project, Black Scientist, Black Activist, Black Icon, about the life and legacy of Dr. Howard McCurdy. And on October 15th, he'll be part of the always popular Bookfest Windsor event, the Poetry Cafe. Welcome, George.
Oh, thank you, Irene. It's so good to be here with you and to be discussing these works. It's marvelous. And I really look forward to getting back to Windsor again.
The other Windsor.
Yeah, the other Windsor. I actually passed through Windsor, Nova Scotia a couple of weeks ago because every year I visit Nova Scotia, generally in August for a week or so, just to catch up with everybody and see some of my favorite parts of the province. Of course, I have to pass by Windsor NS. And every time I think about Windsor, Ontario, and occasionally some of the other Windsors in Canada. There are a few. I think there are 5, actually.
Yeah, there are, but I only count 2. So, George, when and how did you first fall in love with writing and realize that you were a writer?
Oh, wow. I really want to thank you. That's such a great question. Well, really, it goes back to when I was 15, which is incredibly, I have to admit, 48 years ago. But I still remember the day. It was Dominion Day, Canada Day, July 1, 1975. I decided that I was going to be popular in high school. I had just left grade 9. I was about to go into grade 10. And my hope was that I would have some kind of art or talent that would win me some attention in high school. And I thought, speaking in the mid-70s and the age of rock and roll and disco, as a kid who was listening to the radio and buying records, I thought, I got to be a songwriter. I can't sing. I can't play any instruments, so I'm going to write song lyrics. So that day, July 1, 1975, I sat down and wrote 4 songs. I knew they were songs because they rhymed. And then when I started to write poetry, in order to be a better songwriter, I knew they were poems because they did not rhyme. So that was really the start. And then, of course, after getting out of high school and going to university, I kept going and studying English because I kept trying to improve as a poet, improve as a writer. And so that led me from the BA to the MA to the doctoral level and then eventually being hired as a professor. So it's weird, but I wanted to be a songwriter, ended up becoming a professor. But I also ended up becoming a poet and a novelist and writing songs. Not the music, just the words, but I've had several pieces recorded. And every now and then I get a little check, not a big check, but a little check from SOCAN, letting me know that one of the pieces that I authored with a composer has in fact been played somewhere. And very excitingly, I did a piece with Shad, the rapper, a great musician, composer, singer. That piece, the piece I did with him, is called Storm, has been played at arenas, hockey arenas, basketball arenas, for crying out loud. So in some ways, my dream about being a songwriter has come true.
That is awesome. And you have published work in numerous genres of poetry, the song, the novels, and scholarly works, librettos for operas as well, children's literature, and so much more. So at Bookfest Windsor, Festival du Livre Windsor this year, you'll be presenting both nonfiction and poetry on consecutive days. How does your writing routine differ when you're writing poetry, nonfiction, or fiction, do you think?
Sarah, that's another great question. Wow. And it's an active one. It's one I have to debate all the time because right now, as I'm speaking with the three of you today, I'm editing my next book of poetry, which is part of a Canticles series. So it's long. It's 450 pages. But I also have nagging at the back of my mind the fact that I have to get some academic essays completed, which are written but need to be edited. They are really two different ways of thinking. And it is difficult to move from one to the other, I find. For instance, when I'm teaching, which is 8 months of the year, it's very difficult for me to be able to move into a poetry writing mode, except, weekends sometimes, or if I have to be traveling a bit, I can do a little bit of poetry. But for the most part, when I'm teaching, I'm immersed in critical prose, and it's very difficult to get myself out of it. I'd like to think that I can do both relatively well, I hope. And I am kind of used to having to flip from one mode to the other. It'll be interesting this time at Windsor Book Fest for me to start off by talking about Howard McCurdy's book. It's his book, but I edited it at his request. And I'm really excited to have a chance to introduce that book at the festival. In fact, it'll be my first real reading from that text. Now, I got to get it right. Although I wish I had Howard's timbre and tone and immediate grasp of polysyllable, which I confess I don't really have. I'm looking forward to introducing that book. And at the same time, the next day, falling back into my first great love as a writer, which is poetry. One other quick thing I'll say is that in my prose, even in my critical prose, I do try sometimes to inject a little bit of poetry, which I hope happens more or less spontaneously while I'm making my critical arguments. And the reason why I do that is because I don't like reading boring stuff. I don't like reading boring literary criticism. I hate it. And it's unfortunate that part of my job requires it jumping into this academese, which I just hate. So for the benefit of my own readers, of my critical writing, I do try to make it as accessible and as open, and to even use some slang and to use some Black English here and there, just to let people know that there's a real person on the other end of the piece, and not Chat GP2, whatever it is, or Chat GP2. I have no idea what it is. But the fact that we now have AI breathing down our necks means for me that the great benefit of that, not to get away from your question, Sarah, and I share this with my students, so I'll share it with our audience today as well. As a writer, I am not worried about artificial intelligence because, in fact, AI makes authenticity more important. The fact that computers can generate text and it's interesting and it's intriguing and well written makes human created text that much more important. The original authentic text by an original authentic human consciousness has just become way more important and way more valuable. Thank you, inventors of AI, for making actual writers far more important.
That's a very fascinating and unique point of view. I think I've not heard anybody else express that. Wow, that's very cool. So you touched on this a second ago. Your current book is different from your other work. It's an atypical collaboration, really. You've just edited and completed the biography of Dr. Howard McCurdy, a book he had begun prior to his death in 2018. How did you get involved in this project?
Well, Kim, I want to thank you for your wonderful question as well. I was talking about being 15 and trying to become a songwriter. I want to go back to age 19. Like many young Black people then and now, as I reached my later teens, especially in high school and in my first romantic relationships and so on, I began to understand that there was an impediment to my progress, that there were obstacles before me in terms of what I could aspire to do and to be. And of course, I am referring to racism. I'm also referring to classism, being someone who comes from a working class background in Halifax. And so I had a series of mentors in my life in my later teens, 6 adults, who took me under their wing and gave me an incredible education in Black history, Black Canadian history, Black Nova Scotian history, politics, literature, music. And they were all veterans of the radical 60s. So they were filling my head with all this radical stuff and radical talk. And I was reading lots of radical stuff. The Communist Manifesto, of course, lots of Mao Zedong. Holy smokes, Mao coming at me. Woo! It was crazy. It was wild. I loved it. And all the Black revolutionary poetry of the United States in the later 1960s. I was really interested in trying to organize Black youth and be involved as an activist in the Halifax, Nova Scotia Black community. And I heard that the National Black Coalition of Canada was having a meeting in Toronto. I only had some money from my little day job, $150 a week, which was okay. It was good enough for me as a 19-year-old. So I decided to jump on the train and go up to Toronto uninvited, just to crash the meeting of the National Black Coalition of Canada as an arrogant youth, insolent youth from Nova Scotia, from Halifax. I go to the conference, which is mainly held at the King Edward Hotel, King Eddie, in downtown Toronto. And I heard, oh my golly, that every Black Canadian who was an elected person in some capacity in Canada was there. And that included Howard, right? So I met Lincoln Alexander that weekend, who was just going to become the first Black cabinet minister to Labour in Joe Clark's government. Emory Bryant was there from BC. Rosemary Brown was there from BC, right? Rocky Jones, the radical, one of my mentors, was there. And Howard was there. So that's where I first met him. And it was just in passing. I was impressed by him. He was, of course, very well tailored, very well spoken. He had an afro that was absolutely correct, right? And there he was with a cigarette, of course, in his hand, gesticulating, orating, and trying to bring back to life, really, the organization that he founded in 1969. I went up to him and we had a quick conversation, which stuck in my mind. I remember him doubling over, laughing at one point, right? As he's speaking and talking, he's also laughing his head off at the same time. And I know that he also had a fist fight that weekend with somebody who he did not appreciate talking down to the native Black Canadians. So he had to settle that with a quick punch, which his widow, Dr. McCurdy, has told me that, yeah, he could take those kinds of actions from time to time. 1987, I've got my BA in English from the University of Waterloo. I'm halfway through my MA degree at Dalhousie. And I also have a community newspaper I'm running. My own newspaper, 8 pages once a month, a tabloid, and 7,000 circulation. And that was my extra income. I was able to get $1,000 a month out of that little newspaper. I even broke a couple of stories nationally. So Howard McCurdy lost his communications person, who decided to take a new job. But Howard, I learned this after I went to work for him. He told her, his outgoing communications person, to call up every newspaper in Canada to find a replacement for herself. So she called me, that my little newspaper. She called me and said, hey, Howard McCurdy needs a communications guy. Are you interested? So I remembered having met him. I thought, wow, yeah, that would be kind of cool to go to work for him. So I said yes. And a few days later, he called me, interviewed me over the phone. And he told me that he could only afford to pay me $24,000 a year. I was living on $12,000 a year being a 27-year-old dude. So when he said that, I had to pretend it wasn't quite enough money. But really, I was like, yes, I got to take this job. I got to get this job. So off I go to Ottawa. And in that capacity, I worked very closely with him because it was my job to write most of the letters to ministers of the Crown and to constituents and to engage with the Windsor Star, Windsor CBC, and other media outlets to make sure that Howard's name was as prominent as possible in the minds of Windsorites and I'll say our voters, because it was very clear to me that I wasn't going to have it stood off for very long if Howard didn't keep his. I think we did have a symbiotic relationship in working together. He wouldn't edit most of the letters I wrote. He would basically just sign off on them after he read them. And he wrote his own speeches. But from time to time, we would actually work on something together. And I didn't appreciate it enough at the time, but he was Dr. Howard McCurdy, PhD, MP, et cetera, always well-tailored, always ready with a quick quotation, always running up and down the stairs or the elevator between our 6th floor office and the central block, and of course the House of Commons itself, to raise a question or to make a statement, a member statement, and so on. And I became very much impressed by his style, his delivery, his oratory, the fact that he had made a life for himself in so many ways, and the fact that he had that piece of paper, that doctorate. And so I decided, actually my mom also kind of like pushed me and said, you should get a doctorate. And so I applied to the Queen's. I was accepted. And this was in September 1990. So I went to Howard and said, I need to quit because I'm going to go start a PhD at Queen's. And Howard said, don't quit. He said, I want you to keep working for me, but you'll just take one day off a week, Tuesdays. Because Tuesday is a slow news day. I did eventually leave the office in 1991, but we maintained our connection. And we even wrote an article together for policy options. An analysis of what we saw, and I still see as being a huge flaw in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that's essentially the notwithstanding clause. So we published that article together and kept in touch. But finally, 2017, 30 years after I left the office, he got in touch with me and said he wanted me to come and see him. I felt very close to Howard, and I admired and respected and revered him very much. So I went down with my companion, and we rolled down to LaSalle and had a wonderful afternoon with Howard. But the reason he wanted me to visit with him is because he was asking me to edit his memoir. So I really didn't want Howard to be passing on anytime soon. And I really thought when I agreed to do the editing that he would still be around forever and that, I'd have a good chunk of time to sit and talk with him and go back and forth and so on. But as it turned out, that was not the case. I got busy with teaching and other things, and he called me a couple times later, 2017 into early 2018, really trying to nudge me to, get started on this. And I kept saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to do it. And then unfortunately passed away in February 2018. And then it was, I think, a year or two later that Brenda sent me all of the USB sticks. The whole book was there. Right. I think he started it like 2014, 2016, somewhere in there. And he also had a relative of his, Norman McCurdy, do some of the initial editing and so on. And I'm very thankful to him for what he was able to do. It was only really because of the coincidence of being on sabbatical, 2020 to 2021, and the onset of the first wave of the coronavirus. There really wasn't much more for me to do than finally get started on editing the manuscript. When I read that first paragraph, Howard's opening paragraph of his life story, I was hooked. I was reminded by just that first passage of just how incredibly gifted a thinker and writer he was and is in terms of the book. Still is, very much still is. And then I really wanted to work with this material. Now I've edited it, I think, 7 times. Howard's life is now my life. I could almost have dreams, I think, about some of his experiences. And it was a multi-layered life. Lots of struggles, successes, lots of humor, and really distinctive personalities like his grandmother who kept a pistol and had a secret library in her house. She was also a landlord. And one of Howard's childhood jobs was going around collecting the rent for his grandmother. Maybe that's why she had the pistol. His grandmother was also someone who believed in seances, that you could raise the dead, at least their spirits. So he got that kind of background, not to mention his attempt to blow up the Harrisburg town hall as it was there. But luckily for him and for everybody, he missed one of the important ingredients that you need to have for making a homemade explosive device. And he wanted to demonstrate his great abilities at chemistry in order to impress his friends. Every part of it was really engaging for me, his life story.
For many of us who grew up in the Detroit, Windsor-Detroit corridor, Howard has a lot of special meaning. For me personally, he was a mentor and someone who taught me a lot of what I needed to know for social justice work that some folks may know I've been engaged in for a little while. But also it was when he was the chair of the Windsor and District Black Coalition that I met my husband, as we were both elected to that board and got to serve under this incredible intellectual and activist. For those who aren't familiar with Dr. Howard McCurdy, who was he and why do more people need to know about him?
Irene, wow, that's a great question. I think he unveils himself to us in a lot of ways, but I think I have to begin with the sense that from his mother especially, he was instilled with a great sense of Black pride. From the early 20th century to the 1930s, 1940s, some Black people described themselves, or were described as race women or race men. And what that meant was that these were people who were deeply invested in notions of Black equality, Black greatness, what we now call Black excellence. Race men and race women in the early 20th century, in the United States especially, but also somewhat in Canada, were really invested in encouraging all Black people to become educated, to know our culture, to know our history, to know African history, as a way of being able to have that inner strength necessary to combat and resist the allegations of racial inferiority that were really common in the culture in the 1930s, 1940s when Howard's growing up. I think he had that, and also from his father, work ethic, and as well as from the whole McCurdy clan. Because, of course, his uncle was George McCurdy, Alvin McCurdy, who's a great historian, very important, and Murray McCurdy, who almost became the first Black cabinet member in the United States. So on that side of his family, he had so many people who were exemplary. And then from his mother, he was imbued with a strong sense of pride in being Black, and being related to Ethiopian emperors and great kings and queens and resistance fighters. And of course, I can't leave out Frederick Douglass. You've got this Underground Railroad connection with the McCurdy clan, which has been maintained, as Howard says in his autobiography, through every male of every generation. The name Douglas has to be there because of that connection to the Underground Railroad, which is how the McCurdys arrived in Essex County. I think Howard McCurdy was someone who grew up with a sense that he could be exemplary, that he could achieve in whatever field he wished to go into, or fields multiple that he wished to explore, and that no one's racism or classism, for that matter, was going to keep him from rising to the fore. I think also that he really developed a great love of words, of language, of literature, and knew that that would hold him in good stead and whatever he chose to do going forward in his life. So he was someone who was definitely not shy of a camera, not shy of a microphone. There's a photograph of Howard that I remember seeing when I was working for him on the Hill. He's like 18 or 19, and he's striding towards the camera when the snapshot is taken. Black and white, of course. Already at that age, you see a gentleman who is wearing that suit very powerfully. The light just kind of like shivers. Even though it's black and white, the light just kind of shivers around that suit. He's got a serious look on his face. He's about to say something to somebody. But he also knows, as he's approaching that camera, as that picture's being taken, that he is photogenic. He understands that. You can see it in the photograph. He knows he's photogenic, that he's somebody everybody's going to have to look at and listen to. Howard was humble in his way, but I also believe that he had a strong sense of his achievements in sports, in school, and eventually in politics and in winning 2 elections of the Windsor City Council and 2 elections to the House of Commons. And feeling that he also had the respect of the national Black community as well as international Black community in terms of his human rights engagements internationally, as well as right here in Canada and right there in Essex County, with he and George McCurdy, especially, and their allies in the Guardian Club in the late 50s, early 1960s, basically smashing segregationist laws and customs everywhere, and getting a lot of acclaim from some quarters for that work, and in other places, getting a lot of pushback. He talks about that, I think, quite frankly, in the autobiography, where he feels that the Windsor Star, as it was then in the late 50s, early 1960s, did not like the idea of Black Windsorites or Black Essex County folks shining a spotlight on segregationist customs. And I think the reason why for that is a general Canadian reluctance to deal with racism in Canada, because we're so much more accustomed to denouncing Americans for their racism. So we don't like it. We don't like it when we're asked to talk about our own. Because the first thing we're going to say is, but look at the U.S. I understand that attitude. But I think that also lay behind some of the resistance that Howard received for being so outspoken and in people's faces about the need to move towards a society that truly is based on equality of opportunity, as opposed to many, many different types of nepotism. So that's a long answer to your great question again, Ivy. But who was Howard McCurdy? He was a fighter. I mean, if I have to boil it all down to one thing, he was a fighter. This is a guy who had to go into the laboratory, the raceless laboratory, where there were still racist scientists and professors and potential employers who he had to navigate around, who he had to impress, who he had to overcome in order to become a professional microbiologist with a university teaching post. And to achieve that by 1959, when he's 27 years old, and what we think of as the civil rights movement has hardly happened in Canada, and it's only still in its early years in the United States. There's a scene in the autobiography. I think he's in his maybe he's in his early 20s, and he's doing a summer job, and he gets it, and there's a work colleague who's Black, but he was constantly on Howard's back, and he's bigger and looks stronger, more muscular. But finally, Howard has had enough. He snaps, and the two of them engage in a brawl. It's only a 2-man brawl, but it was a brawl. It goes through the warehouse, it spills through the warehouse doors and into the street. And even though the opponent ends up sitting on top of that, even when he's pulled off of Howard, they both know he's not going to be bothering Howard ever again. And I shouldn't emphasize the fist fights because they're very few. They're very, very few. I almost hate to try to put one word on Howard to describe the complex individual that he was. But I think he felt it necessary to always be willing to fight his way forward. For me, one of the most emotional aspects of the work is seeing this man at age 75 being accosted by Canadian Border Police in Windsor. It's shocking. And to understand the reason why this assault takes place is because he's been trying to push the Ontario Human Rights Commission as well as the Windsor Police Department to do simple things like adopting name tags, for instance, in order to reduce the possibility that police officers will feel empowered to beat up on anybody, but particularly Black youth. The fact that he took that public stand as part of the Windsor and District Black Coalition, as it was then called, and the fact that the Windsor police were in attendance when he was being accosted and booked and jailed at age 75 by these border cops is astonishing, disgraceful. And it's no wonder that when his daughter, Linda McCurdy, a lawyer, showed up when the case was supposed to go to court, they immediately dropped all charges So it was clear that it was only an attempt at intimidation. But again, shameful, disgraceful, shocking. But I will also say that even when there were times when I was looking for him and there would be some political or social cause that I would feel very passionately about, and I would go to Howard and say, we've got to react. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. Howard's first response to me was always, do the research, look into this, find out what's really going on, question it all. But if there is really, truly, in the end, an injustice, yes, we will respond. So that's something I've tried keeping an eye with my own scholarship and interventions behind the time. I don't have television. I just have my laptop and my radio. So I don't follow the nightly news. I need to say that before I say what I'm about to say, which is I cannot think of any other federal politician right now, member of parliament right now, who is front and center, who's not a member of the government, but he was front and center as an opposition member of parliament on crucial issues of social justice. Maybe there is somebody out there who is making all these comments and making news in this way, but I can't think of a single member. Howard was always there. He was always there.
That is awesome. What a wonderful legacy. Would you like to read a short little passage for our listeners?
The passage I've chosen here happened in August 1961. It begins by talking about his efforts to reduce segregation and racial discrimination, blunt racial discrimination in Windsor and Essex County. Our struggles to eliminate all white golf courses and white-only beaches, track at the backup of the Labor Council, churches, etc., all willing to boycott negrophobic recreation sites. Notably, not one segregationist facility accepted integration willingly. While these actions are being undertaken, the CCF, the Socialist Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, was seeking to redefine itself as a social democratic party in partnership with the Canadian Labour Congress. New party clubs are being formed cross-country to expand, we prayed, our partisan ranks. Like many younger activists, I wanted the new party to add white collar, pink collar, and no collar to the CCF's blue collar base. The new party's convention in August 1961 also had to launch its name: Contenders, the New Party, or the Social Democratic Party of Canada. The latter choice honored Canuck praxis, wherein parties' names echo their bedrock ideology. Even progressive conservatives, when they still existed, could be progressive on social programs if retarded on social policy. CCF Windsorites favored the Democratic Party of Canada, for we admired U.S. Pres JFK's New Frontier. More space shots, fewer have-nots. 2, we adored ex-Michigan Governor Gerhard Mennen, Soapy Williams' staunchly leftist Democrats. Our local compromise was to conjoin new to democratic. We'd advocate a new democracy. In that Bay of Pigs, April of 1961, our first daughter was born right on time for the new party convention in August. I greeted teasingly that my child's name was Vanilla. Well, the jest spread like wildfire. Quickly had I to circulate her true name, Leslie Lorraine. Assigned to give the premier speech to claim the name New Democratic Party for the new party, I faced a struggle. The national exec had already selected the new party and was printing info to make that cognomen a fait accompli. To beat back this propagandistic and psychological head start, I had to combine King's cadences, Kennedy's wit, and Cosby's timing. I hit on the allegorical theme of Pat and I as prospective parents debating what to call our newborn. That predicament saw me ridicule the notion of any parent dubbing a new baby the new baby. The point resonated, and the new party became the New Democratic Party. Kudos flooded my way. Following this historic vote, CBC Radio's Norman DePoe labeled Windsor delegates, quote, radical left extremists, unquote. Justly peeved, a Windsorite trio tromped up the stairs to the CBC booth to lambaste DePoe for his blacklisting red baiting. A wooden noggin Charlie McCarthy, as ventriloquized by flint-hearted Joe McCarthy.
Thank you for that spirited reading. It's been wonderful to read this book and to see all of the ways that Howard's actual voice shines through the pages of the book. Thank you, George Elliott Clarke, for being with us today. The new book project is Black Scientist, Black Activist, Black Icon, and George Elliott Clarke will be sharing some information and words from this work about Dr. Howard McCurdy at Bookfest Windsor, Festival du Livre at Windsor in October 2023, and will also be appearing with poetry at the Poetry Cafe that same weekend. Thank you so much, George Elliott Clarke.
Thank you so much, Irene and Sarah and Kim. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the questions and looking forward to being in Windsor for Bookfest Festival de Livre.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.